The necessity of semantic arguments in sports science. Ingram Fry. Colloquially, arguing over semantics offers an infinite license to deflect and engage in non-constructive specious arguments. However, within sports science, terminology can be ill-defined or inadequate and in need of revision. What are lengthened partials? A recent study tested the effectiveness of lengthened partials, Wolf et al. The resistance training regime used partial range of motion at the beginning of an exercise. The muscle is longer in the beginning half of the motion than the end of the motion. Therefore, calling these exercises lengthened partials would seem an accurate description. They are partials within the lengthened portion of a given movement. However, the word lengthened implies a comparison to something shorter. If there is no operational definition or convention as to what this comparison refers to, the definition of the word lengthened will inevitably contain different meanings. To effectively review the literature regarding lengthened exercises, it is necessary to contemplate what constitutes a meaningful comparison. I would argue that comparing the beginning half of a conventional exercise to the end half of an exercise is not a meaningful comparison. A meaningful comparison in the view of this researcher would be the length in which the muscle has, or would otherwise be, challenged using conventional exercises. By this definition, the exercise regime followed by Milo et al. Was not lengthened, because the exercises prescribed were entirely conventional. When designing an exercise to specifically challenge the muscle at a lengthened position, partial movements are essentially inevitable. When using cables, the angle of the force being applied ought to be perpendicular with the limb at the start of the movement. The length-tension relationship tells us that the muscle will therefore start off weak and become stronger as the movement progresses. Meanwhile, the arc of the limb will cause the resistance provided by the cable to become less direct and therefore weaker. If progression along the repetition means both the muscle becomes stronger and the force applied becomes weaker, there is a very limited range in which the repetition is effectively challenging the muscle. If many lengthened exercises are by necessity partial, having the term lengthened partial applied to a conventional non-lengthened exercise, at least by the definition of lengthened previously provided, muddies the waters. A literature review that contains both examples without a sensible distinction will be inconclusive. What is strength? Strength, as it is currently used in the scientific literature, makes no distinction between the fundamental unit of the individual muscle or the emergent strength involved in complex movements. The presence of a conscious being draws into question the use of the word emergent, but for the purposes of this argument it is only necessary to agree that the strength of the muscle is a component of the strength displayed during a complex movement. When an exerciser engages in resistance training, it is likely that their goals can be categorized using the terms hypertrophy or strength. However, I would argue that these goals, or respective markers, should not be defining the word strength within the scientific literature. The agenda or aspirations of gaining strength should not interfere with an impartial scientific description and understanding of what is being studied. Trust the process. Recently, the folding of organic proteins has been described in its entirety. A phenomenally complex problem overcome with expansive knowledge, technical expertise, and creativity. However, expansive knowledge, technical expertise, and creativity would never have overcome this problem if it weren't first broken down into its individual components and worked towards by successive generations of scientists. There is a natural progression of scientific knowledge that traces from the most fundamental indivisible components to the more complex emergent properties. It is no coincidence that atoms, molecules, and amino acids were understood before organic protein folding. There exists a natural starting point for scientific inquiry that exists independent of the scientist's preferences or aspirations. Regarding strength, this scientific process has not begun, evidenced by the ill-defined way the word strength is used in the literature. When advocating for studying resistance interventions that isolate specific muscles to the exclusion of all compound movements, it will likely be interpreted that an individual sports scientist is announcing their training preferences or aspirations. So entrenched is the assumption that experimentation in sports science should revolve around real-world aspirations. It should not be interpreted this way. Rather, advocating for experimentation on the isolated muscle ought to be seen as a scientist advocating for beginning the process of doing science. Scientists ought to first seek to understand, with the assumption that unforeseen applications of understanding may reveal themselves in the future. Experiments should be undertaken without any justification or reference to the aspirations of the scientists involved or any foreseen applications. It is proposed that further categorization is made so that within the scientific literature, strength is broken into component strength, the strength of the individual muscles involved in the movement, and observed strength, the manifestation of intention in a complex movement. Stabilization plays a key role in observed strength. If, during the bench press, the biceps are tensing in order to create stability in the forearms, they are actively resisting the motion of the triceps. Therefore, the component strength of the bicep is limiting observed strength. If observed strength increases, we are unable to interpret these results without first understanding the components. It could be that the lifter became more familiar with the load, causing the biceps to become less active. Or it could be that the pectorals and triceps became stronger. Alternately, the lifter may have improved their technique. Likely, it is a combination of all these things. The sensible strategy is to first lay solid foundations by understanding the most basic component, which can be understood scientifically.